With the ancient Greeks, Kyrios was the god mind, or nous. Now koros, Kyrios, signifies the pure and unmixed nature of intellect, wisdom, says Plato. Kyrios is Mercury, the divine wisdom, and Mercury is the soul, sun, from whom Tahuti, Hermes, received this divine wisdom, which in his turn he imparted to the world in his books. Hercules is also the sun, the celestial storehouse of the universal magnetism. Or rather, Hercules is the magnetic light which, when having made its way through the opened eye of heaven, enters into the regions of our planet and thus becomes the creator. Hercules passes through the 12 labors, the valiant Titan. He is called father of all and self-born. Hercules, the sun, is killed by the devil, Typhon, and so is Osiris, who is the father and brother of Horus, and at the same time is identical with him. And we must not forget that the magnet was called the bone of Horus, and iron, the bone of Typhon. He is called Hercules Invictus only when he descends to Hades, the subterranean garden, and plucking the golden apples from the tree of life, slays the dragon. The rough titanic power, the lining of every sun god, opposes its force of blind matter to the divine magnetic spirit which tries to harmonize everything in nature. All the sun gods, with their symbol, the visible sun, are the creators of physical nature only. The spiritual is the work of the highest God, the concealed, the central spiritual sun, and of his demiurge, the divine mind of Plato and the divine wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, the wisdom effused from Ulam or Kronos. Alchemists claim that the primordial or pre-Adamic earth, when reduced to its first substance, is an exegesis, stage of transformation like clear water, the first being the alkahest proper. This primordial substance is said to contain within itself the essence of all that goes to make up man. It has not only all the elements of his physical being, but even the breath of life itself in a latent state, ready to be awakened. This it derives from the incubation of the Spirit of God upon the face of the waters, chaos. In fact, this substance is chaos itself. From this it was that Paracelsus claimed to be able to make his homunculi, and this is why Thales, the great natural philosopher, maintained that water was the principle of all things in nature. It is idle for the representatives of our modern wisdom to close the debate and pretend that the question is settled, merely because the obscure phraseology of the Mosaic account clashes with the definite of exact science. Even the oldest of all sciences, their Kabbalistic secret doctrine may be traced in each detail to its primeval source, Upper India or Turkestan, far before the time of a distinct separation between the Aryan and Semitic nations. The King Solomon, so celebrated by posterity, as Josephus the historian says, for his magical skill, got his secret learning from India through Hiram the king of Ophir, and perhaps Sheba. His ring, commonly known as Solomon's seal, so celebrated for the potency of its sway over the various kinds of genii and demons in all the popular legends, is equally of Hindu origin. Eliphas Levi, the modern magician, describes the astral light in the following sentence. We have said that to acquire magical power, two things are necessary: to disengage the will from all servitude and to exercise it in control. The sovereign will is represented in our symbols by the woman who crushes the serpent's head and by the resplendent angel who represses the dragon and holds him under his foot and spear, the great magical agent, the dual current of light, the living and astral fire of the earth, has been represented in the ancient theogonies by the serpent with the head of a bull, a ram, or a dog. It is the double serpent of the caduceus. It is the old serpent of the Genesis. But it is also the brazen serpent of Moses entwined around the Tao, that is to say, the generative linga. It is also the goat of the witch Sabbath, and the Baphomet of the Templars. It is the Hyal of the Gnostics. It is the double-tailed serpent, which forms the legs of the solar cock of the Abraxas. Finally, it is the devil of M. Udis de Merville, but in very fact it is the blind force which souls have to conquer to liberate themselves from the bonds of the earth. For if their will does not free them from this fatal attraction, they will be absorbed in the current by the force which has produced them, and will return to the central and eternal fire. This last Kabbalistic figure of speech, notwithstanding its strange phraseology, is precisely the one used by Jesus, and in his mind it could have had no other significance than the one attributed to it by the Gnostics and the Kabbalists. Later, the Christian theologians interpreted it differently, and with them it became the doctrine of hell. Literally, though, it simply means what it says, the astral light, or the generator and destroyer of all forms. The will creates, for the will in motion is force, and force produces matter. What is the will? Can exact science tell? What is the nature of that intelligent, intangible, and powerful something which reigns supreme over all inert matter? The great universal idea willed, and the cosmos sprang into existence. I will, and my limbs obey. I will, and my thought, traversing space which does not exist for it, envelops the body of another individual who is not a part of myself, penetrates through his pores and superseding his own faculties, if they are weaker, forces him to a predetermined action. It acts like the fluid of a galvanic battery in the limbs of a corpse. The mysterious effects of attraction and repulsion are the unconscious agents of that will, fascination, such as we see exercised by some animals, by serpents over birds, for instance, is a conscious action of it, and the result of thought. Sealing wax, glass, and amber, when rubbed, i.e., when the latent heat which exists in every substance is awakened, attract light bodies. They exercise, unconsciously, will. For inorganic as well as organic matter possesses a particle of the divine essence in itself, however infinitesimally small it may be. And how could it be otherwise, notwithstanding that in the progress of its evolution it may from beginning to end have passed through millions of various forms? It must ever retain its germ point of that pre-existent matter which is the first manifestation and emanation of the deity itself. What is then this inexplicable power of attraction but an atomical portion of that essence that scientists and Kabbalists equally recognize as the principle of life, the akasa? Granted that the attraction exercised by such bodies may be blind, but as we ascend higher the scale of the organic beings in nature, we find this principle of life developing attributes and faculties which become more determined and marked with every rung of the endless ladder. Man, the most perfect of organized beings on earth, in whom matter and spirit, i.e., will, are the most developed and powerful, is alone allowed to give a conscious impulse to that principle which emanates from him, and only he can impart to magnetic fluid opposite and various impulses without limit as to the direction. He wills, says Dupotet, and organized matter obeys. It has no poles. Our readers will certainly inquire, what then is this invisible all? How is it that our scientific methods, however perfected, have never discovered any of the magical properties contained in it? To this we can answer that it is no reason, because modern scientists are ignorant of them, that it should not possess all the properties with which the ancient philosophers endowed it. Paracelsus calls salt the center of water, wherein metals ought to die. Noah, though a good man, could not have borne comparison with his ancestor Enoch, who walked with God and did not die. The coat of skin worn by Cush, in secret, i.e. when his spiritual nature began to be tainted by the material, is placed on Nimrod, the most powerful and strongest of physical men on this side of the flood, the last remnant of the antediluvian giants. Our visible universe sprang from beneath the luxuriant branches of the mundane tree, the Yggdrasil, the tree with the three roots, Under the first root runs the fountain of life, Udar. Under the second is the famous well of Mimir, in which lie deeply buried wit and wisdom. Odin, the Alfadir, asks for a draught of this water. He gets it, but finds himself obliged to pledge one of his eyes for it. The eye being in this case the symbol of the deity, revealing itself in the wisdom of its own creation, for Odin leaves it at the bottom of the deep well. The care of the mundane tree is entrusted to 3 maidens, the Norns or Parsei, Urdir, Verdandi, and Skuld, or the present, past, and future. Every morning while fixing the term of human life, they draw water from the Urdar fountain and sprinkle with it the roots of the mundane tree, that it may live. The exhalations of the ash, Yggdrasil, condense, and falling down upon our earth, call into existence and change of form every portion of the inanimate matter. This tree is the symbol of the universal life, organic as well as inorganic. Its emanations represent the spirit which vivifies every form of creation, and of its 3 roots, one extends to heaven, the second to the dwelling of the magicians, giants, inhabitants of the lofty mountains, and of the third, under which is the spring, Vergelmir, gnaws the monster Nidog, who constantly leads mankind into evil. The Tibetans have also their mundane tree, and the legend is of an untold antiquity. With them it is called Zampung. The first of its 3 roots also extends to heaven, to the top of the highest mountains. The second passes down to the lower region. The third remains midway and reaches the east. The mundane tree of the Hindus is the Aspatha. Its branches are the components of the visible world, and its leaves the mantras of the Vedas, symbols of the universe in its intellectual or moral character. Who can study carefully the ancient religious and cosmogonic myths without perceiving that this striking similitude of conceptions, in their exoteric form and esoteric spirit, is the result of no mere coincidence, but manifests a concurrent design? Christians call this adoration of nature in her most concealed verities pantheism. But if the latter, which worships and reveals to us God in space in his only possible objective form, that of visible nature, perpetually reminds humanity of him who created it, and a religion of theological dogmatism only serves to conceal him the more from our sight, which is the better adapted to the needs of mankind. The germ of the present human race must have pre-existed in the parent of this race, as the seed in which lies hidden in the flower of next summer was developed in the capsule of its parent flower. The parent may be but slightly different, but it still differs from its future progeny. The antediluvian ancestors of the present elephant and lizard were perhaps the mammoth and the plesiosaurus. Why should not the progenitors of our human race have been the giants of the Vedas, the Voluspa, and the Book of Genesis? The Egyptian pyramid also symbolically represents this idea of the mundane tree. Its apex is the mystic link between heaven and earth and stands for the root, while the base represents the spreading branches extending to the 4 cardinal points of the universe of matter. It conveys the idea that all things have their origin in spirit, evolution having originally begun from above and proceeded downward, instead of the reverse as taught in the Darwinian theory. In other words, there has been a gradual materialization of forms until a fixed ultimate of debasement is reached. This point is that at which the doctrine of modern evolution enters into the arena of speculative hypothesis. Arrived at this period, we will find it easier to understand Haeckel's anthropogeny, which traces the pedigree of man from its protoplasmic root, sodden in the mud of seas, which existed before the oldest of the fossiliferous rocks were deposited, according to Professor Huxley's exposition. We may believe man evolved by gradual modification of a mammal of ape-like organization. Still easier when we remember that, though in a more condensed and less elegant, but still as comprehensible phraseology, the same theory was said by Berosus to have been taught many thousands of years before his time by the man-fish Oannes or Dagon, the semi-demon of Babylonia. We may add as a fact of interest that this ancient theory of evolution is not only embalmed in allegory and legend, but also depicted upon the walls of certain temples in India, and in a fragmentary form has been found in those of Egypt and on the slabs of Nimrod and Nineveh, excavated by Laird. If those who believe in the evolution of spirit as firmly as the materialists believe in that of matter are charged with teaching unverifiable hypotheses, how readily can they retort upon their accusers by saying that, by their own confession, their physical evolution is still an unverified, if not actually an unverifiable, hypothesis? The former have at least the inferential proof of legendary myth, the vast antiquity of which is admitted by both philologists and archaeologists, while their antagonists have nothing of a similar nature, unless they help themselves to a portion of the ancient picture writings and suppress the rest. Well acquainted as may be a scholar with the hieratic writing and hieroglyphical system of the Egyptians, he must first of all learn to sift their records. He has to assure himself, compasses and rule in hand, that the picture writing he is examining fits to align certain fixed geometrical figures which are hidden the keys to such records, before he ventures on an interpretation. And what can these dual myths mean but the physico-chemical principle of primordial creation? The first revelation of the supreme cause and its triple manifestation of spirit, force, and matter, the divine correlation at its starting point of evolution, allegorized as the marriage of fire and water, products of electrifying spirit, union of the male active principle with the female passive element, which become the parents of their Tellurian child, cosmic matter, the prima materia, whose spirit is ether, the astral light. From the poetry of abstract conception, these mundane myths gradually passed into the concrete images of cosmic symbols, as archaeology now finds them. The snake, which plays such a prominent part in the imagery of the ancients, was degraded by the absurd interpretation of the serpent of the book of Genesis into a synonym of Satan, the prince of darkness, whereas it is the most ingenious of all the myths in its various symbolisms. For one, as agathadaemon, it is the emblem of the healing art and of the immortality of man. It encircles the images of most of the sanitary or hygienic gods. The cup of health, as in the Egyptian mysteries, was entwined by serpents. As evil can only arise from an extreme in good, the serpent, under some other aspects, became typical of matter, which the more it recedes from its primal spiritual source, the more it becomes subject of evil. In the oldest Egyptian imagery, as in the cosmogonic allegories of Neph, the mundane snake, when typifying matter, is usually represented as contained within a circle. He lies straight across its equator, thus indicating that the universe of astral light, out of which the physical world evolved while bounding the latter, is itself bound by Emeft, or the supreme first cause. Ta, producing Ra, and the myriad forms to which he gives life, are shown as creeping out of the mundane egg, because it is the most familiar form of that in which is deposited and developed the germ of every living being. When the serpent represents eternity and immortality, it encircles the world, biting its tail and thus offering no solution of continuity. It then becomes the astral light. The disciples of the school of Pherecydes taught that the ether, Zeus or Zen, is the highest empyrean heaven which encloses the supernal world, and its light, the astral, is the concentrated primordial element. Such is the origin of the serpent, metamorphosed in Christian ages into Satan. It is the Od, the Ob, and the Aur of Moses and the Kabbalists, when in its passive state, when it acts on those who are unwittingly drawn within its current. The astral light is the Ob, or Python. Moses was determined to exterminate all those who, sensitive to its influence, allowed themselves to fall under the easy control of the vicious beings which move in the astral waves like fish in the water, beings who surround us and whom Bulwer-Lytton calls in Zanoni the dwellers of the threshold. It becomes the Od, as soon as it is vivified by the conscious efflux of an immortal soul. For then the astral currents are acting under the guidance of either an adept or pure spirit, or an able mesmerizer who is pure himself and knows how to direct the blind forces. In such cases, even a high planetary spirit, one of the class of beings that have never been embodied, though there are many among these hierarchies who have lived on our earth, descends occasionally to our sphere and, purifying the surrounding atmosphere, enables the subject to see, and opens in him the springs of true divine prophecy. As to the term hour, or aor, the word is used to designate certain occult properties of the universal agent. It pertains more directly to the domain of the alchemist and is of no interest to the general public. A priceless discovery that, and now that we have learned so much of the mental labors of the Holy Fathers and their achievements in astral anthropology, need we be surprised at all if, in the zeal of their spiritual explorations, they have so far neglected their own planet as at times to deny not only its right to motion, but even its sphericity? The Trinity in unity is an idea which all the ancient nations held in common. The three Dejotas, the Hindu Trimurti, the three heads of the Jewish Kabbalah. The three heads are hewn in one another and over one another. The Trinity of the Egyptians and that of the mythological Greeks were like representations of the first triple emanation containing two male and one female principles. It is the union of the male Logos, or wisdom, the revealed deity, with the female Aura, or Anima Mundi, the holy Pneuma, which is the Sapphira of the Kabbalists and the Sophia of the refined Gnostics, that produced all things visible and invisible. While the true metaphysical interpretation of this universal dogma remained within the sanctuaries, the Greeks, with their poetical instincts, impersonated it in many charming myths. In the Dionysiacs of Nonnus, the god Bacchus, among other allegories, is represented as in love with the soft, genial breeze, the holy Pneuma, under the name of Aura Placida. And now we will leave Godfrey Higgins to speak. When the ignorant fathers were constructing their calendar, they made out of this gentle zephyr two Roman Catholic saints, SS Aura and Placida. Nay, they even went so far as to transfer the jolly god into St. Bacchus and actually show his coffin and relics at Rome. The festival of the two blessed saints, Aura and Placida, occurs on the 5th of October, close to the festival of St. Bacchus. How far more poetical and how much greater the religious spirit to be found in the heathen Norse legends of creation. In the boundless abyss of the mundane pit, the Ginnunga gap where rage in blind fury and conflict cosmic matter and the primordial forces suddenly blows the thaw wind. It is the unrevealed God who sends his beneficent breath from Muspelheim, the sphere of imperial fire within whose glowing rays dwells this great being. Far beyond the limits of the world of matter and the animus of the unseen, the spirit brooding over the dark, abysmal waters calls order out of chaos. And once having given the impulse to all creation, the first cause retires and remains forevermore in statu abscondito. There is both religion and science in these Scandinavian songs of heathendom. Thor, the eumerization of electricity, handles his peculiar element only when protected by gloves of iron, which is its natural conductor. His belt of strength is a closed circuit around which the isolated current is compelled to run instead of diffusing itself through space. When he rushes with his car through the clouds, he is electricity in its active condition, as the sparks scattering from his wheels and the rumbling thunder of the clouds testify. The pointed iron pole of the chariot is suggestive of the lightning rod. The two rams, which serve as his coursers, are the familiar ancient symbols of the male or generative power. Their silver bridles typify the female principle, for silver is the metal of Luna, Astarte, Diana. Therefore, in the ram and his bridle, we see combined the active and passive principles of nature in opposition, one rushing forward and the other restraining, while both are in subordination to the world-permeating electrical principle which gives them their impulse. With the electricity supplying the impulse and the male and female principle combining and recombining in endless correlation, the result is evolution of visible nature, the crown glory of which is the planetary system, which in the mythic Thor is allegorized by the circlet of glittering orbs which bedeck his brow. When in his active condition, his awful thunderbolts destroy everything, even the lesser other titanic forces. But he goes afoot over the rainbow bridge, Bifrost, because to mingle with other less powerful gods than himself, he is obliged to be in a latent state, which he could not be in his car. Otherwise, he would set on fire and annihilate all. The meaning of the Urdar fountain that Thor is afraid to make boil, and the cause of his reluctance, will only be comprehended by our physicists when the reciprocal electromagnetic relations of the innumerable members of the planetary system, now just suspected, shall be thoroughly determined. Glimpses of the truth are given in the recent scientific essays of Professors Meyer and Sterry Hunt. The ancient philosophers believed that not only volcanoes but boiling springs were caused by concentrations of underground electric currents, and that this same cause produced mineral deposits of various natures, which form curative springs. If it be objected that this fact is not distinctly stated by the ancient authors, who in the opinion of our century were hardly acquainted with electricity, we may simply answer that not all the works embodying ancient wisdom are now extant among our scientists. The clear and cool waters of Urdar were required for the daily irrigation of the mystical mundane tree, and if they had been disturbed by Thor or active electricity, they would have been converted into mineral springs unsuited for the purpose. Such examples as the above will support the ancient claim of the philosophers that there is a logos in every mythos or a groundwork of truth in every fiction. The public is a docile and pious child and readily goes whither the nurse leads it. It chooses its idols and fetishes and worships them in a proportion to the noise they make, and then turns round with a timid look of adulation to see whether the nurse, old Miss Public Opinion, is satisfied. And now to the doctrine of Paracelsus. His incomprehensible, though lively style must be read like the bibliorolls of Ezekiel, within and without. He demonstrates that in man lies hidden a sidereal force, which is that emanation from the stars and celestial bodies of which the spiritual form of man, the astral spirit, is composed. This identity of essence, which we may term the spirit of cometary matter, always stands in direct relation with the stars from which it was drawn, and thus there exists a mutual attraction between the two, both being magnets. The identical composition of the Earth and all other planetary bodies and man's terrestrial body was a fundamental idea in his philosophy. The body comes from the elements, the astral spirit from the stars. Man eats and drinks of the elements for the sustenance of his blood and flesh. From the stars are the intellect and thoughts sustained in his spirit. The spectroscope has made good his theory as to the identical composition of man and stars. The physicists now lecture to their classes upon the magnetic attractions of the sun and planets. Of the substances known to compose the body of man, there have been discovered in the stars already: hydrogen, sodium, calcium, magnesium, and iron. In all the stars observed, numbering many hundreds, hydrogen was found except in 2. Now if we recollect how they have deprecated Paracelsus and his theory of man and the stars being composed of like substances, how ridiculed he was by astronomers and physicists for his ideas of chemical affinity and attraction between the two, and then realize that the spectroscope has vindicated one of his assertions at least. Is it so absurd to prophesy that in time all the rest of his theories will be substantiated? What more natural, then, than this theory of Paracelsus, that this absorbent, attractive, and chemical body of ours gathers into itself the astral or sidereal influences? The sun and the stars attract from us to themselves, and we again from them to us. What objection can science offer to this? Van Helmont, who was a disciple of Paracelsus, says, "Magnetism is an unknown property of a heavenly nature, very much resembling the stars, and not at all impeded by any boundaries of space or time. Every created being possesses his own celestial power and is closely allied with heaven. This magic power of man, which thus can operate externally, lies, as it were, hidden in the inner man. This magical wisdom and strength thus sleeps, but by a mere suggestion is roused into activity, and becomes more living the more the outer man of flesh and the darkness is repressed. And this, I say, the Kabbalistic art effects. It brings back to the soul that magical yet natural strength which, like a startled sleep, had left it. There are two kinds of magnetization. The first is purely animal, the other transcendent, and depending on the will and knowledge of the mesmerizer, as well as on the degree of spirituality of the subject, and his capacity to receive the impressions of the astral light. But now it is next to ascertain that clairvoyance depends a great deal more on the former than on the latter. To the power of an adept like Dupotet, the most positive subject will have to submit. If his sight is ably directed by the mesmerizer, magician, or spirit, the light must yield up its most secret records to our scrutiny. For if it is a book which is ever closed to those who see and do not perceive, on the other hand it is ever open for one who wills to see it opened. It keeps an unmutilated record of all that was, that is, or ever will be. The minutest acts of our lives are imprinted on it, and even our thoughts rest photographed on its eternal tablets. It is the book which we see opened by the angel in the Revelation, which is the book of life, and out of which the dead are judged according to their works. It is, in short, the memory of God. That flash of memory which is traditionally supposed to show a drowning man every long-forgotten scene of his mortal life, as the landscape is revealed to the traveler by intermittent flashes of lightning, is simply the sudden glimpse which the struggling soul gets into the silent galleries where his history is depicted in imperishable colors. As Eliphas Levi beautifully expresses it, nature shuts the door after everything that passes and pushes life onward in more perfected forms. The chrysalis becomes a butterfly. The latter can never become, again, a grub. In the stillness of the night hours, when our bodily senses are fast locked in the fetters of sleep and our elementary body rests, the astral form becomes free. It then oozes out of its earthly prison and, as Paracelsus has it, confabulates with the outward world, and travels round the visible as well as the invisible worlds. In sleep, he says, the astral body, or soul, is in freer motion. Then it soars to its parents and holds converse with the stars. Dreams, forebodings, prescience, prognostications, and presentiments are impressions left by our astral spirit on our brain, which receives them more or less distinctly according to the proportion of blood with which it is supplied during the hours of sleep. But though during its brief sojourn on earth our soul may be assimilated to a light hidden under a bushel, it still shines more or less bright and attracts to itself the influences of kindred spirits, and when a thought of good or evil import is begotten in our brain, it draws to it impulses of like nature as irresistibly as the magnet attracts iron filings. This attraction is also proportionate to the intensity with which the thought impulse makes itself felt in the ether, and so it will be understood how one man may impress himself upon his own epoch so forcibly that the influence may be carried through the ever-interchanging currents of energy between the two worlds, the visible and the invisible, from one succeeding age to another, until it affects a large portion of mankind. The psychometer, by applying the fragment of a substance to his forehead, brings his inner self into relations with the inner soul of the object he handles. It is now admitted that the universal ether pervades all things in nature, even the most solid. It is beginning to be admitted also that this preserves the images of all things which transpire. When the psychometer examines his specimen, he is brought in contact with the current of the astral light, connected with that specimen, and which retains pictures of the events associated with its history. These, according to Denton, pass before his vision with the swiftness of light, scene after scene crowding upon each other so rapidly that it is only by the supreme exercise of the will that he is able to hold any one in the field of vision long enough to describe it. The psychometer is clairvoyant. That is, he sees with the inner eye. Unless his willpower is very strong, unless he has thoroughly trained himself to that particular phenomenon, and his knowledge of the capabilities of his sight are profound, his perceptions of places, persons, and events must necessarily be very confused. But in the case of mesmerization, in which this same clairvoyant faculty is developed, the operator, whose will holds that of the subject under control, can force him to concentrate his attention upon a given picture long enough to observe all its minute details. Moreover, under the guidance of an experienced mesmerizer, the seer would excel the natural psychometer in having a prevision of future events more distinct and clear than the latter. And to those who might object to the possibility of perceiving that which yet is not, we may put the question, why is it more impossible to see that which will be than to bring back to sight that which is gone and is no more? According to the Kabbalistic doctrine, the future exists in the astral light in embryo, as the present existed in embryo in the past. While man is free to act as he pleases, the manner in which he will act was foreknown from all time, not on the ground of fatalism or destiny, but simply on the principle of universal, unchangeable harmony, and as it may be foreknown that when a musical note is struck, its vibrations will not and cannot change into those of another note. Besides, eternity can have neither past nor future, but only the present, as boundless space, in its strictly literal sense, can have neither distant nor proximate places. Our conceptions, limited to the narrow idea of our experience, attempt to fit, if not an end, at least a beginning of time and space. But neither of these exist in reality, for in such case time would not be eternal, nor space boundless. The past no more exists than the future. As we have said, only our memories survive. And our memories are but the glimpses that we catch of the reflections of this past in the currents of the astral light, as the psychometer catches them from the astral emanations of the object held by him. In our opinion, if psychometry is one of the grandest proofs of the indestructibility of matter, retaining eternally the impressions of the outward world, the possession of that faculty by our inner sight is a still greater one in favor of the immortality of man's individual spirit, capable of discerning events which took place hundreds of thousands of years ago. Why would it not apply the same faculty to a future lost in the eternity, in which there can be neither past nor future, but only one boundless present? Notwithstanding the confessions of stupendous ignorance in some things made by the scientists themselves, they still deny the existence of that mysterious spiritual force lying beyond the grasp of the ordinary physical laws. They still hope to be able to apply to living beings the same laws which they have found to answer in reference to dead matter, and having discovered what the Kabbalists term the gross purgations of ether, light, heat, electricity, and motion, they have rejoiced over their good fortune, counted its vibrations in producing the colors of the spectrum, and proud of their achievements, refused to see any further. The alkahest induces the following changes. 1. The alkahest never destroys the seminal virtues of the bodies thereby dissolved. For instance, gold by its action is reduced to a salt of gold, antimony to a salt of antimony, etc., of the same seminal virtues or characters with the original concrete. 2. The subject exposed to its operation is converted into its three principles, salt, sulfur, and mercury, and afterwards into salt alone, which then becomes volatile and at length is wholly turned into clear water. 3. Whatever it dissolves may be rendered volatile by a sand heat, and if after volatilizing the solvent it be distilled therefrom, the body is left pure, insipid water, but always equal in quantity to its original self. Further, we find Van Helmont the Elder saying of this salt that it will dissolve the most untractable bodies into substances of the same seminal virtues, equal in weight to the matter dissolved, and he adds, This salt, by being several times cohabited with Paracelsus' sal circulatum, loses all its fixedness, and at length becomes an insipid water, equal in quantity to the salt it was made from. Paracelsus usually termed salt the center of water wherein metals ought to die. This gave rise to the most absurd suppositions, and some persons, such as Glauber, thought that the alkahest was the spirit of salt. And now we may ask, how can a will manifest itself intelligently and unconsciously at the same time? It is difficult, if not impossible, to conceive of intellection apart from consciousness. By consciousness, we do not necessarily imply physical or corporeal consciousness. Consciousness is a quality of the sentient principle, or in other words, the soul, and the latter often displays activity even while the body is asleep or paralyzed. When we lift our arm mechanically, we may imagine that we do it unconsciously because our superficial senses cannot appreciate the interval between the formulation of the purpose and its execution. Latent as it seemed to us, our vigilant will evolved force and set our matter in motion. There is nothing in the nature of the most trivial of mediumistic phenomena to make Mr. Cox's theory plausible. If the intelligence manifested by this force is no proof that it belongs to a disembodied spirit, still less is it evidence that it is unconsciously given out by the medium. Mr. Crooks himself tells us of cases where the intelligence could not have emanated from anyone in the room, as in the instance where the word "however," covered by his finger and unknown even to himself, was correctly written by Planchette. No explanation whatever can account for this case. The only hypothesis tenable, if we exclude the agency of a spirit power, is that the clairvoyant faculties were brought into play. But scientists deny clairvoyance. And if, to escape the unwelcome alternative of accrediting the phenomena to a spiritual source, they concede to us the fact of clairvoyance, it then devolves upon them to either accept the Kabbalistic explanation of what this faculty is, or achieve the task hitherto impracticable of making a new theory to fit the facts. The ancients were at no loss to discriminate between a blind force acting spontaneously and the same force when directed by an intelligence. Cicero, moved by a just wrath, exclaims, "And what can be more divine than the exhalations of the earth, which affect the human soul so as to enable her to predict the future? And could the hand of time evaporate such a virtue? Do you suppose you were talking of some kind of wine or salted meat? Do modern experimentalists claim to be wiser than Cicero and say that this eternal force has evaporated and that the springs of prophecy are dry? If a bar of iron can be endowed with magnetic properties by passing a current of voltaic electricity over some conductor placed in a certain way close to the bar, why not accept as a provisional theory that a medium may also be a conductor and nothing more at a seance? Is it unscientific to say that the intelligence of psychic force drawing currents of electricity from the waves of the ether and employing the medium as a conductor develops and calls into action the latent magnetism with which the atmosphere of the seance room is saturated so as to produce the desired effects? The word magnetism is as appropriate as any other until science gives us something more than a merely hypothetical agent endowed with conjectural properties. The devil affirms it must be a lie, the pious Abbé Almeguana used to say in a discussion with a spiritualized table. We will soon be warranted in paraphrasing this sentence and making it read, "Scientists deny, then it must be true." We must not neglect to show the grand truths underlying the misunderstood religions of the past. Everything is drawn to its like and converges with natures congenial to itself. Out of this sympathy and antipathy arises a constant movement in the whole world and in all its parts, and uninterrupted communion between heaven and earth, which produces universal harmony. Everything lives and perishes through magnetism. One thing affects another one, even at great distances, and its congenitals may be influenced to health and disease by the power of this sympathy at any time and notwithstanding the intervening space.